So welcome everybody. My name is Kira Sullivan-Wiley, and I'm a postdoc at Notre Dame and co-chair of the Social Science Working Group at the Ecological Forecasting Initiative, which we also call EFI. So if I refer to EFI, that's what I'm talking about. So thanks for joining us today for the panel on best practices for forecast visualization, hosted by EFI's Social Science Working Group. So I'll give the schedule for today. So I'm going to go over logistics for the call first, provide a short overview of EFI, and introduce our panel. Then we'll hear from the panelists, followed by a moderated Q&A session before our time is up at the end of the hour. So we are recording this session. You all should have gotten a notification as soon as you logged on that was the case. And so we're recording it, and we'll make it that link to the recording available for those who are not able to attend. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Jody, that'll go out in the newsletter. So it's not just for people who registered, it's for anyone. So folks can find that later on. And we do ask that you stay muted during the call so we don't interrupt our speakers. During the Q&A, we'll change the rules then, but stay muted during the call if possible. If you're comfortable sharing your video, it's nice to see faces rather than just the names and boxes. This is a family-friendly, pet-friendly, life-friendly kind of panel event. So feel free to share if you feel comfortable doing so. And really quickly, I wanted to share a little bit of information about EFI, about the Ecological Forecasting Initiative. So EFI is a grassroots consortium aimed at building and supporting an interdisciplinary community of practice around iterative near-term ecological forecasts. So iterative forecasts are a great tool for helping inform management decisions, as well as for applying and testing ecological theory and the scientific method. There are many different types of forecasts, but some examples of where forecasts have been used and developed are for harmful algal blooms, for carbon or water fluxes, for invasive species, fish populations, and for tick-borne diseases. So they run quite the range. And there are many more details about ecological forecasting in general and examples of forecasts that have been developed or are being developed on the EFI webpage. And you can check out our playlist of videos about forecasting too, if you want a little bit of more information. I think Jody is probably sharing links in the chat as I go along. So ecological forecasting is an emerging approach. So it provides an estimate of the future state of ecological systems with uncertainty about that prediction of the future state. So just like weather forecasts help us to prepare for the future, ecological forecasts can help us to prepare for future changes in ecosystem function and services and states. So ecological forecasts allow ecologists to make a kind of hypothesis in the form of a prediction of future conditions, and then they can use observations of what actually happens to test those hypotheses. So advances in data collection and computing are helping to make this iterative process even faster. So change is happening, and it's an exciting time. So EFI is set up around 7 cross-cutting working groups, one of which is the Social Science Working Group hosting today's panel. We also have a student association and a Canadian chapter, and most recently, an Australian chapter was initiated too. So EFI has also received some Nsf funding for a research coordination network, or RCN. And one of the major efforts of that grant that was just received, is the NEON Ecological Forecasting Challenge, which is set up around 5 NEON data streams. And that is currently up and running, and we are in our first year of the challenge. And again, you can find more information on that on the website. So that was a quick overview of EFI, very quick. There's lots going on. Anyone here today, anyone in general, is welcome to join in EFI activities. It is a grassroots organization. And so we have members running the gamut from those with no ecological forecasting experience who are just sort of interested in learning and developing those skills, to those who have labs and research programs that are focused on forecasting. Okay, so next thing is to move on to Poll Everywhere. So we use Poll Everywhere, which is a website program to collect questions for our panelists. So this is something that you guys need to be, or hopefully would like to be engaged in. And so I want to make sure that people are on the site and familiar with it before we start the panel. So right now, I think, yeah, so Jody shared the link in the chat, or you can enter into your browser the website, which I just lost my place. But you can enter in, well, what you see there, it's pollev, pollev.com/EFI2021. And you can go in there on your phone or on your browser and type that in. And so this is where you'll be able to enter questions. And as the questions come in, they'll appear to everyone. So anything you type in and hit enter, that question will appear in the banner as it goes down. You'll be able to refresh those and see them. A little sort of note will appear at the top that says, new questions have been added. You can click that, or it'll say, you're all caught up if you're all caught up. And one nice thing about this is that you can upvote. There's the option to upvote other people's questions. So if you have something similar or resonates with you, you can upvote it, and then we can sort by those to see sort of which are these priority questions that are emerging. And we appreciate you participating in this way. We hope lots of questions come in, and you can help us prioritize by upvoting. So you can keep that browser tab open, and as the panelists start talking, you'll be able to submit or upvote your questions to the panelists. And one thing to add to that is if you're on Poll Everywhere, because it's a panel and there are a couple of different people who could potentially respond to your questions, if you have a specific person that you want, I'll be moderating. So if you want a specific person, if you want me to direct that question towards someone specific, you can just put their name in brackets or in quotes or somehow indicate to me that that's who you want to talk to. We'll try to monitor when it comes in and who was talking when you wrote it, but that's an easier way for us to distinguish who we should be asking. So are there any questions on logistics right now? We're going to try not to use the chat function for too much of that. Try to put all your questions in Poll Everywhere. But are there any burning questions right now? No? Okay. So finally, to introduce our wonderful panelists for today. So Dr. Michael Gerst is an associate research professor at the Earth System Science Interdisciplinary Center at the University of Maryland. His scientific work is motivated by helping stakeholders to identify problems and solutions at the intersection of environment, technology, and society. And he will be co-presenting today with Dr. Melissa Kenny. Dr. Kenny is the Director of Research and Knowledge Initiatives at the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment, or IONE. She is a decision scientist with expertise in multidisciplinary team-based science approaches to solving sustainability challenges. After them, we're going to hear from Whitney Woolmer, who is a PhD candidate at the Carey Lab at Virginia Tech. Her research focuses on the relationship between human activities and their effects on water resources. Whitney is leading the development of a macrosystems EDDI module to teach undergraduate students best practices for visualizing ecological forecasts. Right on point for today's panel. So now I will pass it on to Mike and Melissa. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much for being here. I can't tell you how excited I am to see so many of my friends and colleagues that I haven't seen in quite a long time here on the video conference today. And I'm particularly excited today to present to you work on best practices for visually communicating ecological forecasts uncertainty, because this is coming after research that we've conducted on 3 different large studies where we've really taken a deep dive into really understanding the best ways of developing and visually communicating pretty complex data products and outlooks. So before we get into the meat of the presentation, let me just give a little bit of introduction into the work that Mike and I have done for the past several years. So we're multidisciplinary social scientists who do research to really think about how we can increase the use of evidence in a range of climate adaptation mitigation, environmental management, community resilience, and interdependent infrastructure decisions. More or less like if it involves people and the environment and it's really hard, there's not a clear answer, that's the kinds of questions that we really like to think about. The goal is to really understand and improve the processes, the way that we engage between scientists and non-scientists, and the tools like indicators and visualizations and models and scenarios that can aid and improve these decisions in both public and private sector decision-making contexts. So focusing on that, one of the things that really kind of stood out to us as we were starting this research into really thinking about how we can evaluate and improve indicators and visualization products was this quote by Harold et al., where they stated, intuition about good design practice may not always match best practices informed by cognitive principles. viewer preferences may not always be predictive of ease of comprehension. And the reason that that stuck out is that a lot of the ways that we improve our decision support products or visualizations for public users is through feedback. And if intuition and feedback are not always a good predictor, then we really need to be developing much better ways of thinking about how an indicator or a visualization is effective and understandable. And the good thing is that there is data and evidence that we can use as best practices that allow us to do better when designing for public audiences. So for example, some of the examples from best practices informed by these cognitive principles is that it's easier to distinguish color than shape. And color is the most powerful because of this phenomenon. Secondly, if you have two different things you're presenting, then you should group them together and have two different colors so that your visual variables really match the number of dimensions of data. And then third, remembering that power of color. Color and changes imply thresholds. So you want to use these thoughtfully, and it means rainbow diagrams are rarely a good choice. So we want to really think carefully about how we design more of those continuous hue graphics. So then as we think about this and we design for different audiences, I think there's some lessons we can learn from how we think about text-based science communication. Notably that when we design for scientists, or we think about how we design in journal articles, we pack in as many details as we can into one image. And we expect a scientist with disciplinary domain to be able to study it for minutes and pull out all of the different nuances. When we're designing for public audiences, and this is true both for text and for visuals, we need to assure that the key message is not hidden and it can be easily identified by the target audience. So you're really flipping the triangle of how we communicate to make sure that bottom line, that key message is right up top and you can easily answer that and someone can then contextualize that. So what? Why do we care about it? And then any of the details can flow from that. So thinking about these principles in mind, the overarching research question is really thinking about, would using visualization design principles improve the communication of scientific information to non-technical users? We wanted to really dissect this, and one of the ways that we've done this is by really thinking about what's a general method that we can apply that would get us thinking about this in a more rigorous way than just feedback would. And so the approach that we're going to present across these different case studies employs three different steps. The first step is interviews with experts about visualization goals and the audience's decisions and uses, really understanding the context. Second, we diagnose the understandability challenges with those graphics, really trying to understand where might the sticky points be for a public audience. And then third, we've created a method where what we can do is we can think about these diagrams as control versus treatments. So we can take the original graphic that was created, we can develop different redesigned versions, and then test those versions to see what aspects really are resonate and are understandable by the target end user audiences. And today what we're going to do is we're actually going to highlight three examples and talk about the implications for designing ecological forecast visualizations, given those three examples. One is an example using NOAA's temperature and precipitation outlooks. The second is an example using USGS's Water Watch, Water Quality Watch, and Groundwater Watch. And the third is related to USGCRP indicators and National Climate Assessment graphics. So first, this is the paper that was published last year, focused on how we use this method to really think about how to design temperature and precipitation outlooks that are produced by the NOAA Climate Prediction Center for both expert and non-expert audiences. So a little bit of background. These temperature and precipitation outlooks probably are familiar to you if you think about ecological forecasts. They're looking into the future. They contain significant and varying degrees of uncertainty depending on the lead time. And they're presenting in a spatially disaggregated way. And how to best visualize geospatial uncertainty is still an open scientific question, and there's not really a single answer that best defines it. So what we did was we used these decision and visualization principles to really think through this. Using this general method that I just described, that first step we did was to diagnose the understandability challenges. We used a typology that was developed by Descriptive et al. To be able to dissect each of those graphics and understand what works and what doesn't work. We elicited, reported, and revealed challenges that were emerging from those graphics, both what people said and what we were able to tease apart given surveys and interviews. And then given that we were able to identify the challenges, some of the design trade-offs, and the major concerns. So when we look at that, there were four major things that we diagnosed as understandability challenges. And I'm going to go through each of these in a tiny bit of detail. The first is white space outside of the US. If you look at the current and the graphics when we were redesigning them in 2016 and 2017 graphics, what you found is that white space is used both to mean equal chances and to mean no data in areas outside the US. Looking at that, that's one of those things that can be an easy fix by removing no data regions or creating consistency in how you use that color. One of the other things that we found with white space is that these products are produced on different lead times. So for example, here, what you see are temperature outlooks that are presenting both 8 to 14 day outlooks, as well as 3-month outlooks. Most people look at all of these products. And one of the things that happens is when you're using color to mean two different things, you can really confuse a user because they're not thinking about the interpretation in a consistent way. And so you can really improve things by using color and design consistently across your suite of data products. Next, these are just some potentially obvious, but not so obvious, visualization corrections that are sometimes easy to do. So for example, this is an example of clutter where you have text that's really important over different political boundaries or contour lines. So fixing that kind of clutter really helps to make the graphic more readable and understandable. One of the other things is that when you're using some of these probabilities, one of the things that was noted by a lot of the users is that gray probability of near normal for the precipitation outlooks. They had never seen that ever be used. So it was confusing why that was in the legend. And that's just something to note for the scientists so they can really think about how we can communicate that uncertainty most effectively. And then finally, again, one of those consistencies across different products, you really want to be clear about what the contour lines mean. This is an example where the contour lines were not defined in the legend, and they're used differently across different outlooks, like this experimental 3 to 4 week outlook product. So what we did, given that diagnosis, was we tested 4 different images. One was the original, so that's our control. We did treatments for simple and complex and tested those together, where one of them kept a disaggregated probability scale. That's our more complex one. And the simple one aggregated those probabilities and gave some language that could be used to kind of define what those probabilities mean. What we found is that because it's really important to get those probabilities correct, that people don't look at contour lines. So when we did the combined graphic, it actually included both the disaggregated probabilities, but also included some of that language of how you could describe it in a consistent way with what those outlooks look like. Those were tested with a couple hundred users, and as with anything, there were nuances to the results. But overall, what we found is that it was most beneficial to adopt this combined phase 5B graphic, and that it was really important for NOAA to think about the consistency and the look and feel across those Outlook products, since people use all of those products. Additionally, what we encourage is really thinking beyond just sort of a one and done approach to these products, or basing design modification solely off of feedback, and instead to think about these as an iterative approach where we would collect evidence and improve those graphics based off of the evidence. So the reason why this is important is these products go out to hundreds of thousands of users every month. Hundreds of thousands of users every month. And so by investing a small amount of funding in social science research and developing this control treatment testing, we were able to empirically determine whether visual modifications could actually improve understandability and the stated utility of information for decision making. We could reduce misunderstandings of this information so that it was more relevant and useful for different decision makers. And it provided an evidence-based approach for improving forecast visualizations to support NOAA decision making. And before we move to the next one, I really want to highlight that these products are all co-produced. These are products where our co-authors are the NOAA CPC decision makers. We spent a lot of time working with them to make sure that these graphics were meeting NOAA policies. The graphics were modified in a way that would meet operational deadlines. And doing that hand in hand meant we didn't develop something that was just an academic optimum. Instead, we were really working together on what's the best approach to be able to improve these graphics for public audiences, but providing that actionable information to our partners, our NOAA colleagues. Mike?
Okay, great. So this next case that I'm going to talk about is a similar sort of setup where we're looking at a legacy product that's been around for a few decades, and it's going through a process of being reconsidered, how it's structured, how it can be improved. And it's a similar sort of structure where, in this case with the USGS Water Watch's decision support products, there's often very specific questions that the sponsors of the research, or almost, I guess, co-producers, they also work on this with us, as with the project Melissa just described. They're very interested in things that they have a hypothesis might really improve how the diagrams are used, but they also anticipate that that change might be contentious given that the product has been around for decades and people get really used to something and how it looks. It's sort of like when your favorite news website changes its layout. It takes you a few weeks to get used to it, and then you really like it. So for this one, what we did is this setup is a bit simpler. We looked at two phases. One was we looked at this current map with the rainbow color scheme versus a brown-blue color map, which I'll show in a second, without priming the respondents with looking at the legend of the map. And then there was a second round where we did the same thing, but basically forced the people to pause a second and look at what the map actually meant. We measured how well they understood it through a few different tasks, as well as the efficiency with which people were able to answer the questions, and then also looked at their preferences between the color maps, which we'll get to one of the points that Melissa mentioned earlier about subjective versus objective responses and how we measure these sort of things. So the two maps are, as I said, one is the legacy product, which uses a rainbow color map, and then an updated color map that uses a blue to brown color scheme. And so what's shown on these maps are above and below normal stream flow across the US at different stream gauges. And I'm going to dive right into the results. So one of the things that we thought would be interesting to ask at first for the experiment where we didn't show people the legend is just to give them the colors themselves and see if they could rank order them from highest to lowest stream flow. And so this was really interesting in the sense that for the rainbow, basically no one was able to order them correctly. Mostly people could get one right. And this largely occurred because the color black, which corresponds to the highest stream flow on the map, most people thought that meant the lowest stream flow. And green, which was the normal color in the map, most people thought that the normal should be orange. And so there was just kind of a very, without looking at the legend itself, it was very confusing as to how those colors should map to the stream flow orders. When we look at the brown-blue color map, we did the same thing. Here you can see that a much larger percentage of people could actually order them correctly. What was interesting about this is a ton of people got all of the blue ones correct, but what really hung people up again was the color white, confusing that for whether it meant the normal value or whether it was the driest value. And so one quick thing that we already realized out of that is for when you have an anomaly graph, choosing the baseline or the normal category, you have to be quite careful about how that matches relative to the other color maps. For the legend version of the experiment, we also just showed people the legends and asked them to answer questions about them. And I mean, this is fairly unambiguous. People were able to do that fairly well. And there's really no difference between the two. The tasks that we had people to look at, there were 4 different ones. 2 had to do with finding a cluster on the map and clicking on it. So we asked people to find the largest high cluster and the largest low cluster. And then what we also did, one thing we hypothesized is, so the rainbow color map, the normal and above normal distinguished by these sort of very neon green and neon blue colors, which can be a bit hard to see or distinguish. And so the other tasks that we had people look at was we highlighted an area where there was a transition from normal to above and below normal areas, and then asked them to find the point furthest in that was an above normal or below normal dot. And so it's sort of asking them to find this contrasted dot within a vast field of similar color. And so what we found is, so this is what this table and plot is showing is the understandability results. And so this is the percentage of people that basically clicked on the right spot on the map. This maroon colored bar is the original. The one next to it is not having a legend and having the brown blue color scheme. The next are the 2 with the legend experiment, first rainbow and brown blue. What you see is that in general, people found the high cluster tasks easier to get at. What was most interesting though is that if you compare whether or not adding a legend or not, or whether switching the color scheme or not, it tends to affect the different tasks in different ways. And so it was perhaps the most predictable. So if you remember, I mentioned that it's hard to distinguish between turquoise and neon green at a very clustered scale. So this, the task, the above normal task is getting at that. And as you can see, the brown blue modification is very significant, while looking at a legend really isn't. And that's something to be expected. For the high cluster, this was asking people to distinguish between, in the original, it's like a dark navy and a black color. And so the new color scheme makes that easier to pick out. The low clustering, the colors are very distinguishable, but the order of them is a bit counterintuitive in terms of a very fire engine red versus a maroon color. And so essentially forcing people to stop and consider what it means beforehand led to a fairly significant improvement. What was also interesting about this is you see fairly significant effects also with the average time that someone would take if they got it correct. And I mean, while this may look somewhat insignificant if you imagine that people are completing multiple tasks with any interaction with an app. Once you cumulatively start adding, 5, 10, 15 seconds, that might be a non-expert's threshold for just saying, I'm not going to mess with this anymore. I'm going to go do something else. And so the final take home for this one, we also asked people to give their preference for which one they preferred or whether it's roughly the same. The one I'll draw your attention to is in the bottom right corner, where we just asked people which one they preferred. And there's a very, very strong preference for the rainbow one. And so this gets at the take-home message that Melissa brought up at the very beginning, is that if we ask people which one they think they did better on or which one they prefer, it's often very much at odds with how well they actually perform on something. And I think asking these sort of questions of people is no harder than just asking them, I think, which one they prefer. It's not that much extra. And so to quickly summarize, you can see that the color maps can both affect understanding and timing, making sure that you include some sort of step to pause people to actually consider what the image shows them can be important. And the big but here, of course, is that this may not match subjectively how people feel about their interaction with the image. So there's also some nuance in perhaps managing any transition that objectively works better, how that's put into place. And so this last example I'm going to go through really quickly. This was an older study where we looked at indicators from the US Global Chains Research Program and an indicator from the National Climate Assessment. And the context for these is that these are very scientific graphics that are used in a very public-facing way. And so in this sort of science-based approaches where the graphics are selected and produced, there's always a bit of tension between the scientific experts and the folks that think a lot about public communication as to what the optimal trade-off is between, something that looks science-y but is also digestible. And so that's kind of what this study is getting at. So we looked at 3 different indicator graphics, which I'll show you in a second, and tested them against different modifications. We measured how well people understood them, how much they trusted them, their sort of subjective response to them. And we also asked people, or gave them a short test around their numeracy, asked them about their political party affiliation, and also measured their climate attitudes, so sort of their skepticism towards climate science. So the first one we looked at is one on the annual greenhouse gas index, and using the same sort of diagnostic principles, we hypothesized that, so the key message here has to do with this index that's on the right-hand axis. We hypothesized that, radiative forcing is a very abstract metric for, the average person, and showing that also on a 2-axis graph is probably unnecessary. And then we also hypothesized that, the key message that the creators of the graphs wanted the public to get across is that it's only about the aggregate value of greenhouse gases. The breakdown of, what's contributing what is kind of irrelevant for the message that was wanted to get across. And so what we did is we created combinations of getting rid of those hypothesized problems. What this one is showing is just getting rid of the stacked bars. And so you get a sort of minor improvement, but it's not significant. We looked at just getting rid of the radiative forcing axis, and that you start to see something that looks significant. And then when you do them both, you get an even greater improvement. And it's, somebody, you consider that, less than 50% of the people understood what this graph says in the original. I think it's somewhat encouraging that even just making these very simple changes for what is a very complicated metric for the average person does help to some degree. The second one that we looked at is heating and cooling degree days. And so the key message here is that one is going up and the other is going down. When this was being designed, there was a fairly strong preference from the scientific side to show them on the same graph. And you can imagine why that might be a problem for the average person just by looking at it. And so we looked at a few modifications to see what would work better. One of the ones, this is, I think, the most interesting, is that we included a descriptive title. I mean, obviously it couldn't exactly spell out what was on the graph, but it's sort of tangential, or it requires a bit of inference, an extra bit of inference to take what's on the graph and match it with the title. And what happened is it's to some extent opposite of what the trends, the increase and increase is opposite. And so people really picked up on that and just read the title and actually did much worse than the original one. And what was interesting was this is the only graphic that on net people also trusted less than the original. So it points to, like, you know, there might be these simple things that you think are going to really, like, you know, take it home, but it might backfire in a lot of ways if it's not thought out. One other thing that we thought might help is putting in trend lines. This really didn't do much. And what in the end mattering a lot is just putting them on separate graphs, which takes up more space, but it's a whole lot easier to see what's going on. And then this final one we looked at was a graph around average annual temperature. And so this was the main message here, was that it's increasing everywhere. The largest is in the Northeast and the smallest is in the Southeast. We hypothesized that, you know, there's an average time element here, so you don't need to see this decadal time graph for each region. And also, we're not asking people what's going on in, like, southern Mississippi. We're asking people about what's happening in a region. And as you can see from the Southeast, you know, if you just showed me this graph, I'm not sure I could tell you on average whether the Southeast is increasing or decreasing. And so one of the things we did that helped a lot is we just got rid of the time series graphs and actually just put the numbers in of how much each region was increasing. And that helped quite a bit. Another thing we did was obscure somewhat the detail in the regions and have people try to read it just from the time series themselves. And then finally, it's maybe a bit obvious in hindsight, is just get rid of all the detail and put the numbers on the map. And people seem to be able to figure that out quite easily. And so the take home from this is that, you know, I think this shows that pretty simplified diagnostic guidelines can significantly improve you know, how well people understand complicated scientific graphics, and they still look scientific, which is good. One thing I'm not going to go into too much here is some of the tangential questions we ask people that are of interest in terms of if people or how they use information, is that we found that climate attitudes definitely affected people's trusts and subjective responses to the graph. So basically, the more skeptical you were, the less you trusted it, no matter how well it was designed. But people who were more skeptical understood it at the same level as people who were, you know, very not skeptical or accepting of prevailing climate science. So I think, given most of the research we see now on COVID and other, you know, health risks, that it, to some extent, corroborates what we know. Is it's not that people don't necessarily not understand something. It's just there's something else going on that causes them to not trust and ultimately not use scientific information. And then perhaps surprisingly, you know, greater numeracy led to higher understanding.
So then, to nutshell or summarize this, there's 4 things I want you to think about as you think about how this might be relevant to ecological forecasts. The first thing is you really have to take an audience first mentality. You need to understand your audience's goals and capabilities, because you're really designing for them and not for you. Secondly, think about those triangles. For general audiences, you're designing to inform and not to explore. So you want to be really clear and transparent about what that key message is, and make sure in your visual diagram that comes through loud and clear through formal or informal testing. Third, iterative design, and especially co-production with some of your key partners, is really critical to the success of these products. These are not one and done. Think about this like software user design, where what we want to do is think about how we design things, test and improve it, and then make it better over time as we understand how those products are being used, deployed, and contextualized. And then finally, across these 3 studies, I mean, these are 3 really high-profile federal data products. I think one of the things that has been fully consistent across this kind of evaluative research is that these diagnostic design guidelines are a really useful tool for creating more accessible, engaging climate and environmental graphics for the public. And you can get pretty far just by basing your work off of these kinds of best practices given your audience, and can kind of improve them, you know, even further through that kind of control versus treatment or more prescriptive testing. And then finally, I just wanted to share, like, as social scientists, as part of the ecological forecasting initiative, this is research that we're really good at, and we're really excited to work with folks on it. So if this is exciting to you, feel free to contact us. I'll put my information in the chat. And we're also going to be hiring RAUs, GRAs, postdocs, and research staff. So if you're interested in this kind of work, contact us. Thank you to our many collaborators. And Whitney, can I turn things to you?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Melissa and Mike, for that. And I'm excited to kind of pivot and talk a little bit how we can distill some of those concepts you were talking about for an undergraduate audience. Are you all seeing the PowerPoint screen here? Cool.
Yes.
So I'm going to be talking about a teaching module that I've been designing as part of my PhD research with my co-authors here, all at Virginia Tech, which is focused around using ecological forecasts to guide decision making. So I'm going to click over here. There we go. Really quickly, a little bit about Macrosystems EDI, which is a program that is designed to sort of deal with this issue of data science being something that undergraduate students need more exposure to. And so as part of this project, there's a number of teaching modules that have been developed that sort of come pre-packaged and ready for instructors to use in their classrooms. So that includes lesson plans and pre-class readings and activities which are embedded within our code or our Shiny apps. And overall, like I said, these are intended to increase data visualization and quantitative literacy for students who are really in need of sort of in-depth understanding of these messy ecological data sets that are representative of real-world problems. There's a suite of Macrosystems EDI modules. I'll be talking about module 8 today, but just so you know, there are 7 others, which all center around macrosystems ecology and ecological forecasting. But for today, we'll focus on how ecological forecasts and their visualizations can aid in decision making. And in this module, there's we sort of have a suite of learning objectives that we're hoping students will get out of this. The first is just generally to be able to familiarize themselves with ecological forecasting and how they can be used. Secondly, we're hoping they'll be able to identify the components of a structured decision using the PROACT framework, discuss how forecast uncertainty relates to decision making, match stakeholder needs with forecasting decision support, identify different ways that uncertainty can be represented, and lastly, to create visualizations that are tailored to specific stakeholders. So this is all done and wrapped up within an R Shiny app, which is developed using R script, but then sort of published in this nice interactive web format where students can complete and save all of their answers for the different activities. So I'm gonna hope that I can, yes, do you see the web page now? Okay, great. So this is what the app looks like in web format. There's this landing page that sort of walks through a lot of the information I was just kind of telling you all about. There is a slide with some of the key PowerPoint slides that the students see from the presentation that they have at the beginning of the module. And then there's a little bit of an introduction for how to navigate the module and the Shiny app itself, including saving their progress as they go and sort of generating a report with all of their answers once they're finished. So kind of a logistical page. And then we can kind of get to the actual activities. So in activity A, which is the first of 3, students will sort of navigate a list of different forecast visualizations and choose one that they want to kind of discuss a little bit more. So they pick an image, they come down and they answer a number of questions about that, ranging from, does it even represent uncertainty? How is it actually representing uncertainty? Is it sort of this forecast output, or is it converted into an index, and so on? They do this again with a partner, so it's intended to be interactive, and they're engaging with other students, where they would select a different forecast and sort of answer some similar questions, but kind of get at this idea of how are the visualizations different, what are the different ways that uncertainty is being represented, and how can this be connected to someone who might use the forecast. We move on to activity B, which is a scenario-based activity. So we have this sort of use case where students really dive into a lot of nitty-gritty details. I'll give you the gist of it, which is that students are expected to role play as a drinking water manager. And they have this scenario where there's a large swimming event happening in the reservoir, and they have to decide how to treat it. That's essentially what kind of you would get from this text here, with a few more details. So they're kind of guided that they need to optimize a number of different objectives. They have to have good drinking water quality, and you want to make sure there's that the reservoir is healthy, and that the water authority is making money, and that also the people swimming are safe. And so you have these different objectives, as well as different decisions, whether to continue with the swimming event, cancel, or treat the reservoir to sort of improve the water quality, but maybe then you would be decreasing the health of the reservoir. So that's the quick and dirty of the scenario they have to go through. Then they kind of walk through this PROACT activity, where they have to identify the different components of this decision that they're making. And so in this activity, they would have to kind of say, okay, treat the reservoir with an algicide, that is maybe a decision. This one, protect ecological health, that's one of my objectives, and so on. And you can kind of pull these over, and then students can check their answers and say, okay, there's not enough answers here, or this one's incomplete, so on. The next part of the activity is actually getting to the exciting part, where students have to make an actual decision. So they look at the forecast, they have to answer some questions about that, and then decide, actually, I'm gonna go ahead and treat the reservoir with an algicide, and because of that, oh, my ecological health is decreased, I'm lost some money, and then the swimmers are no longer safe. And so they're really using this forecast image to guide their decisions, and they do that sort of throughout time. I won't go through all of those. The next part of the activity actually takes them from using a forecast, as you saw, that has that confidence interval, to a forecast that has been converted into an index. We've got a little issue here with that, how that's showing. Oh, sorry about that. But essentially, this is a different type of visualization, right? And the students have to sort of see how that's influencing the decisions they're making. So let's say we're going to go ahead and cancel that event. We're too unsure about how the water quality is going to be that day. They then go ahead and answer a few more questions about how their decision changed over time, how uncertainty changed over time, and how they were deciding which objectives to optimize. So it kind of walks them through this idea of how they use different visualizations and how that influenced the decisions they were making. And the last activity, really quickly, students are going to choose a specific stakeholder. Let's say they're going to choose a Department of Environmental Quality employee. And given that stakeholder, they have to think about what sort of decision that person might be making using the forecast, and then sort of think about how intensive their decision is, using these decision use categories that are sort of defined within the introductory PowerPoint presentation. So are they a casual user, someone who might need more uncertainty to inform their decision, or someone who's performing some really specific decision analytic calculations? After that, students have to actually kind of look at the forecast data itself and say, okay, this section is sort of supposed to help students think about the variability in the forecast itself. It's not just a single number. It's not just one line. It is a number of values and different possibilities within the forecast. So they say, what's the mean, minimum, and maximum, and what is one reason why there is uncertainty among these forecast estimates. And then in the final objective of the activity, students actually make a specific visualization for their stakeholders. So they have to choose first if they want to convert into an index, and then let's say we want to use a figure here, and we're going to use a time series, and we'll create the custom plot, and that shows that they're using this sort of likelihood of the algal bloom. Whereas they could simplify that and use simply just a word that says, there we go. Okay, there's just a medium chance of an algal bloom. And so they're sort of confronted with this idea of what's the best way to represent this forecast given the stakeholder that you've chosen in the earlier objective. And then there's some sort of summarizing questions on that. Why did you choose to use this one versus that? And who else might be able to use this? How would you change it? And so on. So I'll stop there, and I'm going to reshare my PowerPoint because I want to just share a thank you slide. There we go. So if you're interested in finding more about this module, we'll be teaching this module, Module 8, as well as another, which is just Introduction to Ecological Forecasting in the fall. Please contact us at macrosystemseddy@gmail.com, or you can directly message me or, I'll share the next slide, Kaylin Carey. Our emails are here listed on the slide, and we'd be happy to give you more information or give you, if you're interested in teaching the module in the fall, or we'll also be presenting the module, I think at an upcoming FE workshop as well.
Thank you, Whitney, and thank you all. And Todd, we just we moved your question over to the poll everywhere. So if anyone wants to upvote that, they can do so there. Thanks everybody for your talks, for your contributions. And since we have 7 minutes left for questions, I'm just going to jump right in. And there are questions, so a follow-up. So I think all the panelists have now shared their contact information. So if we don't get to your question or you want to follow up with anyone individually, please do feel free to do that offline. But the first question that got the most upvotes came early on, I think, in Melissa's talk. But it was about, so the climate change map raises the issue of potential trade-off. Oh no, this came up during Mike's, anyway. Potential trade-off between, on the one hand, getting a key message across, and on the other, providing a rich and detailed picture of the data. Are these goals always in tension? And how should designers think about multiple goals when constructing a visual? Excellent question. I'll turn it over to, I guess, Mike or Melissa, maybe for your first thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a good question. And if anyone has a concrete answer to it, then you will become quite famous. But the best answer I can think of is that it really comes down to just simplifying the key message, or knowing what the key message is and who it is that's going to try to be understanding that message. And I guess sometimes I'll describe it as, it's not too much different than, when you're trying to write a paragraph or a sentence, right? You're not going to have a sentence with like 10 clauses on it because no one's going to understand it. And it's the same thing with the visualization. You don't want to, for a non-scientific audience especially, you don't want to create something that has 10 different trends and patterns that you're expecting people to understand. And so in a sense, it's not always intention. If the key message that you have requires detail, then that's fine. And it's not necessarily intention. I hope that answers it.
Well, I think there's one other thing you can think about layering onto that question is what we've been testing up to this point have been these static graphics, and that's because they're the ones in papers and reports. They're used in PowerPoint presentations, in news articles. They are incredibly powerful in getting that like image right matters a lot. But because of the increase in computing power, there's also opportunities to think creatively about how you design that sort of default really well, but then create opportunities for users to customize and layer information. And that might be one of the approaches that could help to address those multiple goals. And we're really hoping to work on some projects in these upcoming years that are going to start dissecting some of those more user-controlled graphics, because I think there's a lot of interesting questions that are embedded in that tension that that might help to address.
That's great. Thanks. And I think there was a comment in the chat also to that effect that increasing sort of interactability of graphics might be helpful in that regard. So there's a relatively straightforward question. So how do you measure understandability in the graphics? So this is a sort of methods question.
Yeah, so when we were measuring that, you can, we basically designed a survey that went out to both, depending on the study we did, it went out either to more technical expert users and or public users. And we really found in some of our research that if you design well for the public, you're also usually improving the understandability for technical users as well. And so these are surveys that are designed to go out to hundreds of folks. You can think about them almost like if you were designing a test for a classroom, where you have a key piece of information you want someone to understand and you test whether or not they can get it right. We have different sort of clever ways that we do that through different kinds of questioning approaches, or Mike showed you with the USGS water watches how we had them do a specific task and linked it to that specific task. And so really depending on the kind of visualization question we had, we designed those surveys in different ways to really suss out what would work best for those different graphics.
Thanks. And I think I'll ask one last question and then maybe ask for Whitney's input on this first, which was a question about, it was a question about climate change indicators, but I think in general, how do you decide when you have a graphic of all the potential things you could modify about that graphic to test how to improve it? How do you decide what to modify and test? And Whitney, I know you had this a little bit embedded in your EDI. So I don't know if you want to take this or kick it over if you don't have an immediate response.
I think I'll definitely pass over to Melissa or Mike if they have to add, but I think identifying what users are struggling with is probably a good first step, and sort of seeing what is lacking in sort of that key understanding of what the figure is trying to communicate. But I think that maybe they can kind of comment if there's other in-depth pieces to that.
Yeah, I think one of the more useful aspects of the diagnostic framework that we had been using, we didn't come up with it, but we've been using it, is that they actually try to match the problem types to ways that someone can go wrong with a graphic. And some of those are much worse than other ones. And so to some extent, I think that helps one prioritize, things that are going to cause someone to completely misunderstand it versus maybe spend an extra second or two. Well,
and for the climate change indicators in particular, I think this is referring to the USGCRP indicators and National Climate Assessment graphics. There were sort of two things that also influenced not just sort of the diagnostic principles. We used that, plus we did some pre-testing on the USGCRP indicators and identified the two worst performing indicators in terms of understandability. So that was the aggregated greenhouse gas index and the heating and cooling degree days. So those were two we dissected. The third one, what we did was we picked one of the graphics where we saw a huge distinction between how temperature and precipitation was presented. And that was that temperature graphic where it had both spatial and temporal disaggregation. Whereas if you looked at precipitation that was presented in that same year, they aggregated it. And we tested different aggregations of that spatio-temporal visualization and found aggregating really works well for those public audiences. And it just kind of gave fuel to the fact that the way they designed that precipitation graphic was spot on, and they could use the same approach to design the temperature graphic and get higher understandability when doing that.
Go ahead, Jody.
Since it's 3 o'clock, I wanted to just jump in, and if people need to leave, go ahead. I think Melissa, it sounds like she can stay on. I don't know about Mike or Whitney, but we may go for a couple more questions if people can stay on, and if not, jump off. And if we don't get to all the questions, if the panelists don't mind answering those questions, we will make all those resources available on the FU website, and I will send it out to everyone that's registered for the panel so everyone can get caught up. But so we can keep going for those that can stay on, and for those that need to jump on off, go ahead.
That sounds great. I think especially there are a couple of questions that target specifically, Whitney, your module and ways to interact with that further. So I think that might be one where having those responses written out and maybe resources and links provided would be really helpful subsequently. And there was another question about any other resources that the speakers can point to that summarize or list out or provide additional resources or pointers for visualization best practices. I think both of those would be especially useful for.
Yeah, we can provide links to those citations.
That would be super. I'm like reordering all the questions because these are great. We're getting lots of thumbs up. So there was another question about, and I think this is for Whitney as this relates to the Shiny app. If you're seeing an improvement in big picture thinking as a result of the Shiny app exercises, are people zooming out?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think one of the things that's really nice about this module is it does force students to kind of take a step back and think more about application, whereas a lot of students in ecology are thinking more about nitty-gritty modeling and data, and this combines that in a nice way that would lend itself well to big picture thinking. We're still in the beginning stages of sort of collecting data for this study. So basically the module in its current form, or it's sort of in a beta form right now, but it's more or less we'll be testing this fall, where we'll be measuring sort of a pre and post change in students' responses to a number of questions, which is when we'll be able to kind of answer that question of whether or not they're thinking more big picture. But that is that's definitely our goal, and we're hoping, among others, along with the learning objectives, essentially, like how is this module affecting students' understanding?
That's very cool. Just editorializing here. My privileged position as moderator. So maybe one more question. I'm looking through to see if there are any that I can sort of smush together, but they're all really good questions. I had one about sort of the question about preferences, how people prefer one sometimes that they actually are getting less from, maybe, or understanding less well. And if you have any insights, does that maybe have to do with if they're prettier kind of or not, or like more aesthetically pleasing maybe, and how that interacts maybe with the idea of shareability, that if as social media become an important way for intellectual ideas to get out there, do those things interact at all? Sort of, is there a trade-off there with something that's maybe prettier, more likable, and something that's actually providing more usable content? I think is what that question is getting.
That's a good question. I think part of what we were seeing with the USGS water maps and people really preferring the rainbow color maps is that for the average public, if they do see, information dense natural world related map. It's a temperature forecast, and that's almost always a rainbow color map. And so I think partly what you're seeing there is people just associate that with trustworthiness, and it's something they've seen since they were 10. It would be interesting to see if we see that sort of effect with other, I guess, common conventions or color schemes that people are used to. That's maybe the best answer I have for that question. Of Whitney or Melissa, you have a better answer.
It really is an interesting question. I think so much of the way that these graphics have been improved over time has been by feedback. And so I think really going outside the box and thinking about how you design those graphics differently to improve the usability. I mean, I really have to applaud our collaborators like Emily Reed and Jennifer Bruce and Megan Hines and Charlotte Snow and John Gottschalk and Dave DeWitt and Scott Handel and Matt Rosenkrantz. I mean, our collaborators that have worked with us really closely are innovative thinkers at their federal agency, and the way that they're structuring and redesigning these graphics. And I think that, I mean, I was really surprised to have empirical evidence that showed so definitively people's preference being really, really different from what we were able to prove increase the usability of a graphic. And it just highlights over and over to me both the importance of working closely with our partners on these graphics and the design and making sure the science is right, as well as the audience and the operation of these products, but also really thinking rigorously about how we're building new processes into the design and development of our data products, such that the evaluation and the utility and the design of these graphics is thought about as that is as critical as the construction of the data product itself, that we really are thinking from the beginning about our users and how we can design these graphics to more effectively meet their needs. And I think if we start to see the shift to more of these kinds of iterative, co-produced forecast products, as ecological forecasters, since we're, a field that's just getting started, we can get ahead of the curve and make sure our products are understandable and usable now, instead of a couple of decades from now, once those products start to take hold and get operationalized. So I think that for me, it just really highlights a unique opportunity for us to be really proactive in using our social science expertise.
I'll just add quickly that we've also kind of experienced this within my lab at Virginia Tech on a small scale, working with the Water Authority that we produce forecasts for, and that it just really emphasizes the importance of co-production and throughout the entire process, right? If you're not producing a forecast of something that user is going to use, then the data visualization isn't going to be useful for them either. And ensuring that it can, that it can work it into their workflow as well, and can be something that's usable from an understandability point of view, but also a functional point of view of how they access that visualization and how they use it to make specific decisions within their workflow.
That's really wonderful. I don't know how many minutes we wanted to go over. I feel like we're having a really nice discussion. But yeah, I don't know if we have time for like one last question, or if we should wrap it up. One last question. Okay, this is great. Because this is, I think, what just got touched on is a nice sort of the harnessing of innovation coming from NOAA, from USGS, or from these users in a co-production thing. I really like that. There was a question though about the time it takes. I guess this sort of like getting over the hump, like going like the tension between sticking with what's familiar and maybe you've grappled with it and you feel like you finally have a sense for how this graphic works, and now someone's going to change it on you, even if it's better, that sort of that hurdle that everyone has to go over. Is there the question is, how long does that take? But I guess, can you even expand on that as can you help people through that process? Is there testing for how to do that the best way, like how to introduce a new graphic, or how to actually make that transition for people who, especially in contexts where like the USGS or NOAA or folks who have had a way of doing something are now trying to switch and provide something new? Does the process get eased in some way, or is that just it's better, get used to it?
Well, I mean, some of this gets into the operations, which is sort of outside of the realm of where we work, and how those decisions get made and what the rollout looks like. I think the opportunity, and we talked with our colleagues at NOAA, and I know they're in the process of considering implementing the recommendations that were made, and I know our colleagues at USGS are thinking about how they're going to refresh the suite of WaterWatch's products, and we're hopeful that this helped them to inform some of the decisions that they're doing with that entire refresh. And with the 5th National Climate Assessment coming up, we're hoping that these results will help people think about how to design graphics for those reports. But I think the jury's still out. I mean, I think about it similar to if my favorite website got overhauled. I mean, Mike gave that analogy, is that I might kind of cringe at first because I had these mental shortcuts, these heuristics that I would use to navigate to my favorite part. But it might have just been because I was used to clicking in a particular way. And if I was new to that website, it would have been really horrible. So those kinds of refreshes, if I were to just kind of use my own experience as a model, it's about 2 to 4 weeks until I'm like, oh yeah, this is better. And we'll see with different users. I think what we'll find is that users are high technical, our users that are used to going to those graphics a lot, they'll notice it immediately. Ones that are more casual users of those products, it won't even register because it's like going to a new website. So I think there's an unanswered research question in there, and there might be some literature within the UX community that might inform some of the expectations around when people would feel like it was better.
That's really great. So I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank all of our panelists again for their fantastic contributions, and also remind everyone on the call, so the recording will be shared. I think Jody has said it'll go out in the newsletter, but also go out to everyone who registered for the workshop, for the seminar panel, whatever we're calling this. And the panelists have all shared their contact information too, so that will go as well. So anyone who wants to follow up individually. I think we've started a really good conversation here, so hopefully it goes on and all of us are enriched by this. So thanks everybody, and have a great week.